Hey folks, welcome to our first lecture for week one. This is the introduction to phonetics in the IPA. So this really corresponds with chapter one in your text and what we'd like you to focus on. So let's get started. And I apologize, sometimes my computer's a little slow when I'm presenting with PowerPoint. So, what we're going to be studying today is what is phonetics. Okay, so really this class. Um, and this is really a core area of linguistic studies. And this class is specifically focused on clinical linguistics. So, how we use phonetics to study children's speech sounds or adult speech sounds, for example, how we transcribe them, how we analyze them to see if children are exhibiting some type of a phonological process, have a articulation disorder. So that is really the difference between clinical phonetics and um, phonetics if you're just studying it from a linguistics perspective. So what we're going to talk about is studying sounds, so how we articulate them, what parts of our articulators do we use, our teeth, our tongue, for example. How do we perceive them? So how do we perceive different speech sounds? What helps us perceive one sound that's different from another? And how do the sounds vary by how we produce them and perceive them? So, for example, if you think about the R sound, people make the R sound in different ways. There's actually up to 32 different ways based on the environment of where R is produced and how it's produced. So it's very important as we go through this to understand this is a very complex topic, phonetics. Okay, so why is it important for us to learn about phonetics? How does it used in the real world? Well, if you're going into speech pathology as a career or going into audiology, it's important because we use phonetics to transcribe a person's productions. And we use it in teaching reading and writing. So right now I'm pursuing a certification in dyslexia, and I am teaching a student about the sounds of the language and how they correspond to letters. So when we write them, orthography or spelling, how that works. I also am teaching about syllable shapes. So everything you're learning in here is what children learn when they're starting to read. And many of us don't remember it because it was many years ago when we learned to read. But a structured literacy program teaches actually a lot of what we're learning today. It's important for second language learning. So how we produce sounds is different in different languages, right? So it's important when you're learning a new language, where to put the stress, for example, and on different syllables. If we think about actors and accents, how we say words, how we pronounce different sounds in different languages, is what makes it different, makes the languages different, right? So I was studying Italian over the last couple of years, and it's very difficult to suppress what I already know in English to, try and pronounce words without my uh, New Jersey accent, for example. Um, Phonetics is important for technology such as Alexa, uh, understanding different accents and dialects and sounds, and being able to, for example, transpose them into text. So if you've ever seen a text message, even our closed captioning here transposed, often there's many, many mistakes. The technology has not been perfected. And many of you are linguistics majors, so you are studying this because you are interested in language and linguistics. Okay, so what are the skills that clinicians require as far as phonetics? So you have to be able to collect data. Okay, so um, often if you're working with children who are suspected to have an articulation disorder, you have to be able to listen to them and record the sounds that they make, and then be able to analyze them to see if they're disordered. Um, so really being able to train your ear to hear those differences. It seems like it would be simple, but sometimes differences are very subtle. Okay. And then what we're going to be working on in this class, especially, is being able to transcribe. So being able to quickly listen to what someone is saying and be able to just transcribe it into the IPA language. I say language because IPA really is almost like its own language. So we're going to talk about IPA in a few minutes. Okay. So what we're going to cover in this course is transcription using the International Phonetic Alphabet. We're going to talk about articulation, how sounds are produced in the vocal tract, and what articulators are used. We're going to describe and classify different sounds. So, for example, some sounds we will talk about as being voice that are we're using our vocal cords when we produce those sounds, and other sounds are voiceless. Our vocal cords don't vibrate when we make the sounds, and we're going to talk about this a lot as we go through individual sounds. We're also going to talk about how there's differences even within a language. So within English, there's different ways that people produce sounds. I am not from California, so you will hear that I definitely produce some of my sounds differently than folks who are native Californians, for example. And then really more towards the second half of the course, we're going to talk about clinical applications. So we're going to take the information that we transcribe and we're going to analyze it as if we were analyzing a student's actual productions. Okay, so why are we interested in studying this? Well, we have to make sure that we are accurately conveying information. So when we're listening to a child and determining eligibility for special education, for example, we want to make sure that we're accurate in our transcriptions. We also want to be looking at what we call phonological analysis. So this is really looking for patterns. So some children who have articulation disorders have what we call phonological disorders. So it isn't random. We're actually looking for what are the patterns, what are the constant mistakes that they're making on their productions to see how we can focus on treatment. So that really is what the clinical application is for phonetics. And then linguistic applications is really talking about research, so comparing phonetics between different languages. Okay, so in your text, there's an image, and this may not make a lot of sense right now, but it will as we start to delve into doing transcription, especially towards the end of the semester. So there's different ways that we can analyze data. So we can look at, so for example, when we do an articulation test, first of all, there's different ways that we're listening for a child's productions. So we may be listening just one sound at a time. Let me hear you say this sound, for example. Or we may be listening, how do they produce that sound in a word? So let me hear you say sit. And how does it differ if they're producing it in a different position of a word? Let me hear you say, let's see, hats, to see if it's produced differently at the end of a word versus the beginning of a word. We may be listening to it not just one word at a time, but we may be listening to it in a sentence. Does their production get less accurate the longer the production that they're trying to produce? And then our ultimate goal is that when they leave therapy, they can produce it accurately when they're having a conversation with their friends on the playground, for example. When you're doing some analysis or your assessments, sometimes you're only listening for one sound. That's obviously the simplest, but sometimes you're listening for multiple sounds in the same production, and that is definitely more complex. You really have to be able to multitask and pay attention. And then as we're going through this diagram here, there's different ways of scoring and analyzing. So two-way scoring is just correct or not correct. Um, Five-way scoring is really analyzing the data for not just whether it's correct or incorrect, but what is the error? Are they omitting a sound in a word? Are they substituting another sound? Is it just sound like it's distorted? So that's really what five-way scoring is about. And then ultimately, phonetic transcription is really transcribing a word exactly the way the child said it. Okay. Simple. So how are we studying phonetics? So we are really looking at articulatory phonetics. So other ways that we can study phonetics is using technology. We're not going to talk about that until we get to chapter 3. But here's some examples if you're interested in how technology is used to study how sounds are made. And you can look at that if you'd like. Okay, so this is a poem which kind of shows how complex the English language is. And you'll hear a lot of people comment that English is actually a difficult it is a difficult language to learn because the sounds are not made consistently. And there isn't always a one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. So I'm just going to read this first stanza from the poem. When the English tongue we speak, why is break not rhymed with freak? Will you tell me why it's true? We say so, but likewise few. And the maker of a verse cannot cap his horse with worse. Beard sounds not the same as heard. Cow is cow, but low is low. Shoe is never rhymed with foe. So, as you could see, many words are spelled the same, but are not produced the same. Okay, when we phonetically transcribe them, they're not going to look the same. So as you could see by this cartoon, um, children start to pick up on the fact that we have different spellings for the same sounds. So for example, the sound f can be transcribed, or if it's a word spelled with either a PH or the letter F. So same letter, but different sound sometimes, or different letters and same sound, vice versa, right? So in this example, you're asked, how would you pronounce this word based on how it's spelled? So I'm going to give you just a few seconds to take a look at it and see what you think. So most of us would look at it and probably want to pronounce it as goatee. But we could actually pronounce it as fish. So as you could see in some words, that GH is actually pronounced differently, right? So in women or nation, okay, it's pronounced with a different sound. So sound and letter correspondence are not reliable, okay? So we can't always we can't always sound out a word. So I'm working with a student with dyslexia, and some words we just have to memorize. We call them sight words because we can't sound them out. They do not follow the rules of typical sound letter correspondence. Okay. Okay. So how does the alphabet fit into this? Well, the alphabet is really what we call graphemes. So they're letters that are used to write a language. Okay, so they represent consonants and vowels, but as we were just talking about, that sound to letter correspondence is not necessarily always one to one. Okay, so sometimes We have silent letters. Sometimes we have two letters together, which are supposed to represent one sound. And then sometimes we have letters that represent more than one sound. Okay. So these are just some examples here. And as you could see in this second example, the IPA symbol for the E sound is actually the letter I. So this may get very confusing for folks who have not taken phonetics before. I know some of you had. And don't worry about it. You will eventually learn to think in IPA. It just takes a lot of practice. Okay. Okay. So what is the IPA? Well, the IPA stands for the International Phonetic Alphabet. And in this case, one symbol does correspond to one sound. So it makes it easy for us to transcribe without having to think of all the complexities of that lack of one-to-one correspondence in English, for example. It is an international alphabet. We are not going to be studying the entire international alphabet. We're going to be looking at English. So what are the IPA symbols for our language here? Um, as I just was mentioning with the previous slide, sometimes what we know as the letter sound correspondence is not what it is in the IPA alphabet. So, for example, as we just talked about, the I in the IPA alphabet actually is signifying the E sound. Um, this example here, what we know is the letter J is not a symbol for the sound J. It's actually a symbol for the sound Y, as in yes. In the following example, that is the symbol for the sh sound. So we wouldn't write SH, we would write this symbol here if we're transcribing an IPA. And as you could see in this cute little cartoon, we have to start to learn that multiple sounds are represented by the same sound can be represented by multiple letters, and that is why we have this need for the IPA so that we can be consistent. Okay, so um, we are going to talk about allographs in the next lecture, but allographs are really how we might produce sounds slightly differently, but still recognize them as the same sound. So in the IPA, there really is only a one-to-one correspondence between sounds and letters. So really, it's about memorizing. So it's memorizing what symbol represents what sound. So you eventually will see that I, and immediately your brain will say that's the E sound versus it. Um, we're not going to delve into a lot of detail on diacritics. Diacritics is really used a lot in research, not so much in clinical practice, except in, rare cases. But diacritics are really representing how there might be some different changes, subtle changes in how certain sounds are produced. And just so you're aware, we use slashes when we're doing phonemic transcriptions, and we use brackets when we're doing that more what we call narrow transcription, um, looking at those subtle differences of diacritics. Okay, so we are going to be doing quite a bit of phonetic transcription. So phonetic transcription is really us being able to listen to someone and then write down what we heard. So that one-to-one correspondence between the sounds they produced. Um, spelling, you not only do you have to suppress what you know about English letter sound correspondence for some of the IPA symbols, but you also have to suppress what you know about spelling, okay? Because we are not going, it's not a one-to-one correspondence with spelling. So for example, if there's a silent E in a word, we don't transcribe that. We only transcribe the sounds that we hear. So in this little cartoon here, we want to start thinking in IPA. So years ago, there was this very funny episode of The Simpsons, And it was when Bart Simpson was learning French. And when he starts dreaming in French, he's fluent in French. And this was a joke that if you started dreaming in another language, um, that means that you're fluent. You're starting to think so much that you can dream in the other language. So hopefully by the time you finish this course, you won't be having nightmares in phonetics, but you will be able to, you know, really be able to think in the IPA alphabet language. Okay. So again, we're going to focus on sounds, not spelling. We're going to have to really develop good listening skills. So a great way to do this, there's extra practice exercises posted on the Canvas shell, is to just start listening, identifying the beginning and ending sound in words, for example, and counting out sounds and syllables. Okay. And as I mentioned, I'm working with a student with dyslexia, and every lesson we do this. We count out the sounds, we count out the syllables. It's really becoming very aware. That's what meta is. Meta is thinking about something. So we're thinking about how we produce sounds. Um, when we're transcribing, we're always transcribing the sound with the same symbol, the same IPA symbol. So the first sound, doesn't matter what word it's in, if you hear that first sound, it's always going to be transcribed with the same symbol. Um, as I just mentioned, silent letters are not transcribed. So in this little cartoon, a word like autumn, why is that in there? We don't hear it, right? So if you don't hear it, you don't write it. Okay, and as I mentioned before, there's what we call broad transcription, and then there's narrow transcription. So broad is what we're mainly going to be doing as clinicians. If you're taking this class, and you're going to eventually be applying to graduate school to become a speech therapist. So we mainly are using broad transcription. So just listening for the sounds and then transcribing. Narrow transcription is when we're including these extra symbols, these diacritic symbols, which are looking at very fine nuances between how individual sounds are produced. We're going to talk about it, but we're not going to delve into detail on that for this class. Okay, so that is it for our show. So I'm going to end my show here, and I'm going to end our recording. And